So good evening, everybody. This is our few announcements. The sign up for Over the Line, which is history of the Association for the Wolf Lake Initiative, and after 20 years, we plan on publishing it maybe by mid-year. But definitely before October, when we start our 20th year, actually, as an organization. So, and we do have a sign-up sheet here in case anybody wants to be notified when it will be available. But anyway, this is, in case you came in wrong classroom, this is the Calumet Revisited. But I think just about everyone here has been here before, so don't worry about that. And some of you have been here before for Larry's previous talks. I think this is the second or third time, Larry. Third time.
I think so.
Yeah, I think so. And and I was asking him, I'd forgotten about his history. I know he got his doctorate from the University of Chicago in 1970, and that was in theology, PhD.
Well, religion and social science.
Okay. Okay. And then he started Governor State University and had spent many years there. And he taught sociology. You were chair of what department?
Humanities and social science.
And then I was asking about his undergraduate degree and from LA.
Occidental College.
Occidental College. And then in Africa?
University of Ghana in West Africa.
West Africa.
Sheckley career.
Right. And do you want to add any? I think before I've released his publications, so everybody's aware of his publication. And anything new on the publication front?
Yeah, I'll talk about that.
Yeah, we'll talk about
okay,
it.
right.
Yeah.
I'll just take over. All right, I'll take over. I'm glad to be back, and I'm currently working with editors on 3 books. One is the big book is on the Underground Railroad in the Chicago region, and that's probably going to be well over a year before that's out. And I've got 2 other books that are in process. One is on the story of Carolyn Quarles, a young woman who escaped from St. Louis in 1843, and the other is on the Underground Railroad south of Chicago. And those both should be out, and you'll probably, in one way or another, I'll have Mike telling you about that stuff. But I've been digging into this research about 20 years, and the last couple months I've been having a really good time learning a lot about Northwest Indiana. And so I'm going to may have some particular questions for you. But because we're a small group, it's always helpful for me just to know who you are and where you're from. And I've been thinking about Northwest Indiana in terms of counties. So can you tell me, Larry McClellan, I live in Crete in Will County in Illinois. And who are you?
Walter Skiba, and I live here in Whiting and in Lake County.
That's Lake, right, okay, right, okay, good.
Valerie Pennon and Hammond in Lake County, so not too far.
Right, Hammond's in our story tonight, yeah.
Richard Morrisville, East Chicago.
Okay.
Richard Chambers. I've lived in Hammond for most of my life, and before that, all of it was in Lake County.
Gotcha, Lake County, okay, great.
Brad Miller, Gary from Lake County.
Gary, okay. And you know Mike?
Oh, me?
And?
Okay, Ann Anson. I'm from Belgium, Illinois, Cook County. I was born and raised in Cook County.
There you go, okay.
Mary Kuznier, Chicago, Cook County.
Okay, Mary. And?
Joanne Podcole-Murphy, Cook County.
Okay, so we have Cook County and Lake County. I was hoping that we might have some Porter County and LaPorte County people here, but we'll get to them on another day. And I've got one at the very end. I've got one or two questions where you all might want to be helpful to me in some. But so, anyways, what I like to do is talk with you for a while, and then at the end have some time for questions. And we know that the big storm will be delayed until after 7, so we're not going to go till 7, but we'll all be on the road by 6:30 or so, and we'll miss the big ice storm. So thank you, Mike. That's great. Okay, so we're looking at the Calumet region, and to start off, I've got two of these kind of classic images from the history of the Underground Railroad. One is a classic picture that was taken of, this is used by the Library of Congress all the time. This was taken of a group of freedom seekers, fugitive slaves, that were living in Canada, near Windsor, across the river from Detroit. And I'll have something to say about the people in this picture a little bit later on. And the other image is an image that we all know, which is the classic image of talking about fugitive slaves that was used in all kinds of broadsides and all kinds of literature. I use interchangeably the terms fugitive slave and freedom seeker. And a lot of us like to refer to folks as freedom seekers because we're talking about a remarkable group of people that, according to the law, were in fact fugitives breaking the law. But remarkably, as individuals and families, these were people that were committed to finding their freedom in any way possible, to find their freedom escaping out of slavery. And so very often you'll see that I use that expression, freedom seekers, as is the case with a lot of people around the country who are dealing with this kind of remarkable story of people seeking their freedom. And so to begin with, whenever we talk about these things, we always have to talk about the conditions of slavery. And sometimes in our current discussions, people get a little bit flippant about the nature of slavery. We need to understand how profoundly awful all of this was. This was people owning other people, people that were, Africans capturing Africans and taking them to the coasts and selling them into slavery. Somewhere in excess of 12 million people were taken by boat into the Americas. Interestingly, of that 12 million, only about 400,000 to 500,000 actually came to what becomes the United States. But overall, the condition of slavery was absolutely overwhelming. And of course, this kind of remarkable sense of understanding that people were treated as property. When I do research on the Underground Railroad in Missouri, I don't look at population records. I look at estate and tax records because I have to find the property. I have to find the cows and the pigs and the horses and the slaves. And that's where the information is. The notion of slavery is just astonishing. One of the great, great untold stories of slavery is the incredible sexual exploitation and suppression of slave women. And that what part of this kind of great stain in American history, there is a kind of a sexual part of that which is very, very profound, and someday some folks have got to start talking about that. Now, in response to the terrible conditions of slavery, people wanted to get free, and they headed north. And as fugitives came into the north and other places, they created, if you will, the Underground Railroad, because whites and blacks living in the north particularly had to figure out how we're going to respond to all these people coming through. And their response was, over time, organized into the networks that came to be called the Underground Railroad. And of course, it was not really a railroad, and it was not really underground, but in the 1820s and 30s, the great kind of razzmatazz technology was the technology of the railroads. And so it is just kind of not surprising that they would use railroad language to talk about the journeys of these people seeking their freedom. This is a great image from the Western Citizen, which was an abolitionist paper printed in Chicago, and it shows an underground railroad, and they've got the train going into the mountains, and of course, again, it was not really a train, it was not really underground, but we think the best story we have is that in the early 1830s, some slave catchers were in Kentucky, were after some slaves. They got across the Ohio River into Ohio, and the slave catchers were right on their trail, and they got safe, and then there were abolitionists helping them. And when the slave catchers got across the river, they were just gone. These fugitives were just gone. And the story says that one slave catcher, Kentucky guy, turns to the other and says, "I don't know what happened. They must have disappeared on some kind of underground road." And that story kind of morphed into the talk of an underground railroad. And that this had connections all over. And then they started talking about stations and routes and conductors. But it wasn't ever really that. Okay. Now, where did it go? This is a map from 1850, and I think it shows dramatically the free states are in red. In 1850, California was admitted as a free state. The slave states are in black, and my arrows kind of suggest the various ways in which people headed for freedom. There were folks that went into Mexico, a number that fled into the West to live with native peoples. There were people that went into the Caribbean. We've got stories of fugitives commandeering ships to take them up the coast. And then, of course, most came into the northern states. Now, a couple other things that are really important in looking at this map is recognize that Missouri and Kentucky, and then also Maryland and Delaware, they were slave states that were not part of the Confederacy. And so part of what makes the Civil War so complicated is that in the Union, you still have Kentucky and Missouri, and that makes things very problematic. Another thing that's intriguing about that is that this whole edge of Missouri along the Mississippi borders Illinois, and down across the bottom of Illinois, we border Kentucky. So Illinois had more actual miles facing slave states than anywhere else in the Union. And so that's one of the reasons we had an enormous number of slaves that came through. And another thing that's intriguing about the map in understanding the whole story is realize that the southern part of Illinois, with Cairo, is further south than Richmond, Virginia, and most of the state of Virginia. Illinois had this unique southern exposure, which is very powerful in why so many people ended up coming up into our neck of the woods. Okay, so we're really looking at this region, of course, the Calumet region right here, and the source of getting to places in Detroit into Canada. And then, just want to kind of remind you where we are in relationship to the state of Illinois and Indiana and getting to Canada. Now, the traditional view here in Illinois is you can, quote me on all this, I guess. Indiana has an Indianapolis-centric view of history and of the Underground Railroad. Now, you as residents of Lake County might be sensitive to that. But, sometimes I bet you feel you're the forgotten part of Indiana, because Indianapolis tends to look at the rest of the state, not at Northwest Indiana. And all of the stories and almost all of the published material on the Underground Railroad is reflected on this map. And that is that the movement was up, and it was straight up, and then to Canada. And you'll notice there's nothing there. That's because very little attention has been paid to it. The reality is that there were thousands of fugitive slaves that came right through your backyards. And that's part of the story we're uncovering now. Okay, in Illinois, through 1861, it may be more than 10,000 fugitive slaves came through or settled in various parts of Illinois. And my research over the last 20 years makes it, I feel very clear that coming into northeastern Illinois, there were 3,600 to 4,500 freedom seekers. And that meant that during that period, 2,000 to 3,000 traveled right through northwest Indiana. What I've finally decided is the best way to talk about it is that essentially of those freedom seekers coming through Illinois, roughly a third of them headed to Canada by ship out of Chicago. Roughly a third went overland through northwest Indiana, and the final third came through northwest Indiana on the railroad. And so that's a way of thinking about it in threes. So like about 1,000 to 1,500 went by ship, 1,000 to 1,500 went overland through our backyards, and 1,000 to 1,500 went through our backyards on the railroads. Now, there are uniquely in northwestern Indiana a unique constriction. And again, this is something you're probably aware of in other contexts. But realize that we're sitting in the middle of a 20-mile corridor. That people who were traveling by boat and canoe, people that were traveling by horseback, and then people traveling by wagon and stage, they were constrained into this 20-mile corridor between Lake Michigan and the great swamps and marshes of the Kankakee River. And the early Native American folks understood that, and the development of the Soft Trail, reaching from Detroit, coming across Michigan, coming across Illinois, and going to the Mississippi River around Rock Island. That was the great, and it was no accident that the native peoples, that the Salt Trail comes right through here, because they couldn't walk across the lake, and if they went, for 50, 80 miles, it was really out of the way getting to the settlements around Detroit. And then the stream that develops on top of that is the development of the Detroit-Chicago Road. And the road was, again, from Detroit, starting in about 1825. They were, the federal government has only been involved in two major road programs in our history. The first was the National Road, going down through the capitals of Ohio, from Columbus to Indianapolis to Vandalia and to St. Louis. That was the first great road trip, road expenditure by the federal government. And the second one, the second major one, was the development of the military road from Detroit to Chicago. That was well underway in 1825. And that road it followed the Sauk Trail across southern Michigan, headed right to New Buffalo, and then basically went along the coast. In 1837, that road was shifted inland, and it crossed the Calumet River, and I'll get to that story in a few minutes. But part of what's key to understanding our story is that because of geography, movement across Indiana and Illinois was constrained into this 20-mile corridor. And if you think about people being in Detroit, the French and the British and then the Americans, looking west, I think it's very intriguing, and I'm still working on why is LaPorte called LaPorte County? What does LaPorte mean?
The door.
The door. And my hunch is that for the French, hundreds of years ago, they understood that if you were sitting in the regions of Detroit, the door to the west was right here. Okay? And so LaPorte, the door to the west, is right here because the native peoples understood if you want to go to the west from the Detroit region, you have to go through this door right here. That's the only way to get west. Okay? You with me? All righty. Now, when we turn to understand those corridors of movement, we turn to where is there underground railroad activity. and what I'm going to be exploring with you tonight are these sites. And you'll notice, again, here is the Sauk Trail, and here is the Chicago Road. And it is simply no accident that those places of activity that we have historically recorded, of there being some interaction of the Underground Railroad with passing freedom seekers, is in this narrow corridor. Now, directly south of Chicago, there are two places of real importance to us: the crossing of the Little Calumet River and an area around Crete down in Will County. So we want to look at those, and then we're going to look at Northwest Indiana. Here we have on a contemporary map, here's the southern end of Chicago, the Little Calumet River, the Dalton Bridge and the Ton Farm, the Indiana Street Bridge. Those of you that know the Dalton Riverdale area, the Indiana Street Bridge is the location of the Dalton Bridge, and about 2 blocks from it is the location of the Ton Farm. Directly south, down in eastern Will County, it was a collection of activity in Crete and then along the Sauk Trail. And this is the Sauk Trail coming across here. And again, there was significant activity in this area. Looking first at the southern end of the city of Chicago, you can see here the bend in the Little Calumet River. The Illinois Central line, main line, runs right here. The Indiana Street Bridge is right here. Starting in 1837, this was the Dalton Ferry, and the Ton Farm was located just to the east of that. And we have some people here that have been involved with that project. This is on the Illinois Metro Electric line, looking straight east, and that is the Indiana Street Bridge, and the Dalton Farm is essentially 2 blocks down. There were Anglo-American settlers at the Riverdale crossing, where that bridge is located, starting in the 1830s. And those people established a ferry in 1837, and the Chicago Road was realigned from the beach onto to come across that road and head across into Indiana. A family known as the Daltons and a variety of others. A contingent of Dutch families arrived in the Roseland, Dalton area in the late 1840s. And they had been involved in their own experience of religious oppression and political oppression in Holland. And some of them were particularly eager to be of help to freedom seekers. And so 2 families in particular, the family of Cornelius and Mary Kuiper, and Jan and Angie Tun, were directly involved with assisting freedom seekers. And those Dutch families had connections coming well into Indiana, and we'll see a bit of that in a few minutes. These are the 2 fellows, Cornelius and Jan Tun, and Jan and Angie Tun in the 1880s. This was their farm right on the Little Calumet River, which is now part of the Calsac Channel. And some of us are involved, walked in just as we started. Tom Shepard, you want to wave your hand, Tom? Tom is helping to coordinate a group of us who are working on the story of the Ton Farm and its impact. The Ton Farm site is located just south of the Golden Gate neighborhood and the Alkel Gardens Murray homes, right on the Calumet River. And we've got a wonderful cycle of stories about Cornelius Kuiper and the Tuns being of direct assistance to freedom seekers who were coming through. And we have submitted an application to have this site added to the national list of Underground Railroad sites, which is maintained by the National Park Service. We're working with folks that live there, and there's one guy that owns an old kind of marina that he's starting to restore right at the end of St. Lawrence at what's called 134th Place. But it's right, the Little Cal is right on the other side of these trees. Several years ago, a remarkable young man named Lerone Branch, for his Eagle Scout project, worked with the First Reformed Church in South Holland to establish an Underground Railroad Memorial Garden to honor Jan and Angie Tun. And this is was really a neat project that someone's had a hand in. Okay, so what we're talking about is the Ton Farm located right here. The old Chicago Road, which it had been along the coast of the lake. The old Chicago Road came down, crossed the Little Calumet at the Dalton Ferry, and went on. And of course, this is the Michigan City Road. You know, it went on to Michigan City. That was the original Chicago Road. The Ton Farm was located just off of that bridge, and that memorial that I showed you is just a few blocks south. So we have a huge number of freedom seekers coming into Northwest Indiana that come down this Chicago Road from abolitionists working in the city. They all cross this bridge, and they take the Chicago Road, Michigan City Road, into Northwest Indiana. And we'll get to that in a second. Now, several miles south, down in eastern Will County, the Crete Congregational Church was organized in 1853, but there were these Congregationalists working, assisting freedom seekers starting in the late 1830s. And we've got very, very strong documentation. And also, a lot of them are all buried in the cemetery. The church is here in the background, but the cemetery dates, the cemetery is about 10 years earlier. The cemetery and the church date from the 1840s, and we have very, very strong stories of their engagement. And in eastern Will County, here is the middle of Old Crete. The cemetery is right in the middle of Old Crete. There were a number of farms on the edge of Crete, and these folks were involved. Also, there were farms and farmers along the Sauk Trail, which goes comes here through the bottom of Cook County. Where did I put my bottle? There it is. Okay, now, part of what I want to do is to really stress the importance of these corridors of activity. And the first one that I've pointed to is the old Chicago Road. And we have looked at where it crossed just on the west side of Lake Calumet. And remember that at the beginning, the old Chicago Road was along the beachfront. And there's a cycle of wonderful stories about the old Chicago Road. About this, my favorite is the story about the guy that one of the stagecoach drivers would, this was from the early 1830s, that he would take the stagecoach along the beach, and you could get from, back. You could get from Michigan City to Chicago. You could do that in 6 hours when the weather was perfect, because the beaches were like a hard concrete road. And they would just, go like crazy. And the great story, I think, is that from the early 1830s, is that there was one of the drivers that knew that the Chicago River and the Calumet River both were so slow and sluggish that as they deposited stuff in the lake, they built a huge sandbar across the mouth of the river, which was not apparent, but it was there. And, they had to destroy that in Chicago to make Chicago a port. Well, this stagecoach driver would run in perfect weather, would go hell-bent for leather along the beach from Michigan City, and he'd hit the Calumet River at that time was, I think it was around in here someplace. But he'd hit the mouth of the Chicago River, and the horses knew. He would wheel the horses into the lake, and they would just pound into the lake. And of course, he never told the passengers. So the women would faint and scream, and the guys would yell at this, and everyone would just get hysterical because they thought the driver had gone bonkers. He had turned right into Lake Michigan with his stage. And of course, what he had done was he had gone the 100 yards or so to the sandbar, and then they wheeled onto the sandbar, went across the mouth of the Calumet River, and then wheeled it back onto the bank and onto Chicago. And I've always thought, my God, that'd be exciting to do with a stagecoach. But in 1837, they went from the beachfront. They moved it so that the Chicago Road came straight out of Chicago down to the Dalton Bridge, and then came around over through Michigan City. Now, the second great corridor is the corridor of the Salt Trail. And as I pointed out, in the Crete area, the Salt Trail also developed an alternative, and this was because Crown Point was the county seat, the post road from Joliet to Valparaiso, here in near Steger and South Chicago Heights, the post road went south, and so it really became a kind of post road became part of the Salt Trail corridor. Okay, now do you see where those lines are? Now we're going to see, so where was the activity on the Underground Railroad? At the same time that after, in the same place, after those roads went through, you had eventually in 1852 the extension of the Michigan Central line from Detroit into Chicago, and also in 1852 the extension of the Michigan Southern line into Chicago. And for our stories, interestingly, there was also in 1854 was the completion of a rail line from the Ohio River straight up the center of Indiana, and that came to Michigan City. That followed an ancient road, an ancient Indian trail that also went straight up. And I've uncovered some fugitive slave stories of people traveling up on that trail. And that's a little bit outside of our bailiwick, but that's going to be in the stuff I'm writing. Now again, seeing where the Salt Trail is, coming here from Dyer, through Valpo, LaPorte, coming up into Michigan, the Chicago Road coming across and joining up. And essentially the Chicago Road used the Salt Trail going into Michigan. Okay, so what about this Detroit and Chicago Road? Established in 1825 and used until the railroads came in 1852. It was the major track for wagon roads, and starting in the 1830s for stagecoaches. And it went from Dalton's Bridge and the Little Calumet River across through Hammond, the Dunes, Crispin, Chesterton, Tremont, and Michigan City. And we have got Underground Railroad stories tied to each of those places. To begin with, the Dutch in around the Ton Farm carried people we know into what they called Holman's Bridge. And right in the center of Hammond, and you know where Holman Avenue? Okay, where it crosses the Little Calumet, right there, just on the north side was the farm of the Holmans, who had come from Germany and England, and they built a small bridge there, and then they built a kind of an inn and a tavern, and then some other farmers came in. But we don't know if the Holmans themselves were directly involved, but it's highly likely that they assisted freedom seekers. We know for certain that Holman's Bridge was a stop where freedom seekers were assisted. Going further east into the dunes, there is a kind of a whole cycle of stories about activity in the dunes. 3 or 4 historical records indicate that people knowing about fugitives hiding out in the dunes. And there also is a fascinating incomplete story about the Alpha Wreck, the so-called Briggs Project. Any of you heard about this before? No. Any of you know about this? Okay, well, in an area right on the dunes, near what's called the Devil's Punch Bowl, there is a wreck of a lake steamer. And that was discovered, 50, 80 years ago. And there's been serious archaeological work going on there. Now, there is a story, and I'm not sure if I fully believe it, but there is a story that we have found in the records that says that what happened was that this lake steamer would travel from Chicago and stop at various places, including the Punch Bowl, would stop at various places to pick up passengers or freight or whatever. And the story goes that one time when this lake steamer stopped at the punch bowl, it took on some fugitives and hid them underneath. And then they were essentially confronted by a group of slave catchers. The slave catchers came on board and then insisted that there must be slaves, and everybody said, no, no, no. And in the ensuing confrontation, the boat was set on fire. And of course, everybody bailed out of the boat, but it just burned and sank right there. Now, what we have is, we know that there were freedom seekers hiding in the dunes. We know that we have a burned wreck there. And the question is, can we put them together? Well, maybe. But it is a really interesting story.
Where along the dunes is that supposed to be?
I'm not a Northwest Indiana person, so it's east of Miller Beach, near Hart's Ditch. It's in a section of beach along Hart's Ditch. Now, it may not be visible because these folks have all taken steps to protect it. But the state of Illinois is very sensitive about this. You know, they do not, on any maps, identify exactly where it is. But it's in the neighborhood of Hart's Ditch, which is that near Portage? What is that?
Burns Ditch, maybe?
I'm sorry, Burns Ditch.
Ditch.
I'm sorry, I'm in Burns Ditch. Thank you. Yeah. Again, I apologize. I'm not in Burns Ditch. Yeah, where Burns Ditch comes out. It's right in that area. Thank you. Now, like I said, we've got 3 or 4 historical records that point to the fact that fugitives were in the dunes, that abolitionists were helping them there, but we don't have it tied down yet. And let me say, and I really should say this about 20 times, if you ever run across any stories, or anything in family histories or anywhere, please let me know. Because that's where we find, in the public record, there is very little about these events. But very, very compelling stories. Now, just south of Burns Ditch, there's a small settlement known as Chrisman, and there is one very solid reference to the establishment of a home by a family named Smith in the middle of Chrisman. And that was reported by a guy named Briggs, the Bridge Project. Briggs was a school principal in this area in the 19-teens, 1920s. And he did a lot of local history research, and he wrote a lot of things. I've read a lot of his stuff. And it reads true, and it's difficult to explain exactly what that means. But it's the way he writes it, I think he is recording real historical memories. That people were telling him real stuff. And I tend to believe what he's written about the Smith home in Chrisman. Going a little bit further to the east, there's an interesting cycle of stories about Henry Hageman and his family as being open to and receiving fugitives coming across on the Chicago Road. And then we've got 2 very good references to Green's Tavern, a family named Green, and that they were maintaining a place in what was originally called New City, which was now is Tremont. And it was one of those kind of plans for developing a city to rival Chicago. Well, New City never really happened. But Green's Tavern in Tremont was a very clearly a source. Now, another part of the Dune story, which I tend to think is historically accurate, has to do with the railroads. We have some interesting stories of people living in the Dunes region. And of course, the Michigan Central came right through there. And of having abolitionist families in the Dunes who had connections with people on the railroad. And we've got some wonderful stories of people preparing lunches and things. and the trains would slow down, and the lunches would be tossed up to conductors to be given to families and individuals who were traveling on the trains from Chicago to Detroit. And I tend to think that those, again, are accurate stories. I'm working on about a 40-page, I'm 20 pages into about a 40-page research paper. And so a lot of this stuff, all these citations will be available to you at some point. So the Michigan City Road, the old Chicago-Detroit Road, continues on, and it comes to Michigan City. And Michigan City also has some abolitionist families, most notably the family of Daniel Lowe. And Lowe's family had settled there in 1835, and we've got documentation that said that he may have helped, he and his family may have helped as many as 150 fugitives. There's another very interesting story and documentation that there are 2 travelers, fugitives that were coming through that got sick. They were tended to by Lowe's family and ended up dying and are buried in the Lowell family cemetery. And again, I want to find those, I will have those kind of references available for people that are interested. But the other thing that's intriguing about Michigan City is that this was the site of the that train line that came from southern Illinois, southern Indiana, from the Ohio River, came straight up, and it came right to Michigan City. And the train came into the same little depot where the Michigan Central stopped. See the train lines come together right there? And one of the cycles of stories I have says that the Michigan Central had, on a number of their baggage cars, they had created small, separate rooms, traveling spaces, for fugitives. And I have a story of a person coming up on the train from the Ohio River and being hidden in the depot and then being transferred onto the Michigan Central to get to Canada. So we've got some really direct Michigan City stories. And then in a few minutes, I'm going to tell you the stories of Henry Stevenson and Bush Johnson, both of which have to do with Michigan City. Okay, but moving right along. Okay, so what I've just told you is on the old Chicago Road, we've identified a number of places where stuff happened. And then there's a similar dynamic on the Sauk Trail. Remember, though, the Sauk Trail is hundreds of years older, and of course it was originally a walking and horse riding trail. And in 1921, this picture was taken in Illinois of a section of the Sauk Trail that was bypassed by the wagon roads. And you could see what developed over hundreds of years, the kind of indentation that these great trails would develop. And the Sauk Trail was, in its day, the great thoroughfare through the wilderness in our region. And then going across the Sauk Trail, there are places in Dyer, Crown Point, Maryville, Valpo, Westland, and LaPorte. Okay, real quickly, in Dyer, there's an interesting set of assumptions about the State Line Hotel, which is arguable, but it's interesting. Going further along, traveling on the old Sauk Trail, you come into Maryville, and one of the things that's intriguing, if you ever do this, is if you take the old Sauk Trail, it's now 73rd Street. When it gets to Maryville, you realize that what it does is it comes up on an old beachfront. And you know that 12,000 years ago, Lake Chicago was about twice as big as Lake Michigan. And one of its major beachfronts was along what is now the route of the Sauk Trail. And when the native peoples, 1,000 years ago, whenever started developing the Sauk Trail, they created the trail, and it rides on the beachfront. And if you drive on 73rd Street, you will see that to the south is this ridge. Well, that's the old beachfront from Lake Chicago from 12,000 years ago. And the Sauk Trail ran along that 73rd Street. As you come into Maryville, the Sauk Trail wobbles a little bit, and you can see this house sitting up on the top of the ridge. And this house is on the site of the original house of Dr. Henry Palmer, who was the first physician in Lake County And that house is marked. This was the first, this was put up in 1949, this Underground Railroad sign, and that was the first Underground Railroad sign established in the state of Indiana. Interesting stories about Dr. Palmer helping both travelers on the Sauk Trail and also helping freedom seekers as they came through. If you head further east on the Sauk Trail into Valparaiso, there's stories about a family of W.B. Williams. To the southwest, any of you know the Inn at Aberdeen? Well, it's an old now bed and breakfast. There's a story, and I'm a little shaky, but it's worth investigating. There's a story of folks that when the Aberdeen Inn was built, that it was used as a stopping place. There's also in the area near the Inn at Aberdeen, the story of the William Riggs family, who were advocates for the Underground Railroad. And then north of Valpo, there's the story of the Norman Tanner family, which again is, I think, is a pretty substantial story. Probably the great stories in Northwest Indiana have to do with Westlake. Okay, Westlake, which is Porter County, kind of close to
Westville.
Westville, close to, it's kind of northeast of Valpo, right?
Below Michigan City.
Yeah, and there are two very interesting clusters of activity. There was a Union Church, which were basically congregational people, and then there was a very well-established Quaker community. And we've got some very interesting stories of these folks all working together to help freedom seekers on their way across. And they've got the names of the families there. We've got stories for basically every one of those families, both Congregationalists and Quakers. And then there were several families, again, related to the two congregations, that lived closer to how do you say it? Wanata? But I think that the real work that needs to be done in Northwest Indiana, and I hope I can do some of it, is really looking at this cluster of activities around Westville. It's very, very interesting. And Westville figures in two other extraordinarily important stories. The story of Carolyn Quarles, which I'll tell in a minute, and the story of Charles Osborne. And you may not know it, but you have buried here, outside of Westville, the father of American abolitionism, the man who started all of this, the man who began opposition to slavery in America. Charles Osborne, in 1814, was working in Tennessee and finally decided, as a Quaker minister, finally decided that the call of God was too great and that we must advocate the immediate abolition of slavery. And William Garrison, the great Boston abolitionist, had declared, when Osborne died, declared that Charles Osborne was the father of abolitionism in America. In 1817, he published a monthly magazine called The Philanthropist, and he was the first person in print in America to advocate for the total and complete abolition of slavery. And among other greats like Benjamin Lundy, who were at the start of this movement, Benjamin Lundy learned things, worked briefly for Charles Osborne. And this fellow ends up, at the end of this remarkable career, he ends up moving with his family to the Quaker community outside of Westville, and then lives here for a couple years, and then dies. But a just absolutely remarkable man, and I bet you none of you have ever heard Charles Osborne. You know, one of the great American heroes, and is totally gone from our national story. One of the great images is in 1842 and 1843, there was real controversy within the Quakers because although the Quakers were mostly anti-slavery, they were also very conventional folks. And they got very upset because some of the Quakers were becoming rabid abolitionists. And so they kicked them out of the Friends meetings. And so all of the abolitionists formed in Indiana. They seceded from the Quakers, and they formed the annual meeting of anti-slavery Quakers. And so the Quakers who opposed slavery were on one side, and the Quakers who really opposed slavery were on the other side. And they had two separate organizations. And they were separated from each other and very bitter toward each other for about 10 years. But the Quakers were very, very strong advocates on behalf of freedom seekers. Up in LaPorte, there's a cycle of stories about the Bigelow family and other folks in LaPorte. And so, again, you can see what I've done is with the arrows, kind of showing you that there is a very rich set of stories that goes all the way across our region. And there were freedom seekers that went from here into South Bend, which is right here. But overwhelmingly, the folks on our two tracks went up into southwestern Michigan. And I think that's one of the things that's important. Our story really is not a South Bend story. That was a very different dynamic and very different set of phenomena. Okay, now, real briefly, three quick stories. First of all, as early as 1834, there were some black families living in northwest Indiana. And in 1860, there were 72 black individuals in the census in northwest Indiana. I don't know any of those stories, but those are very, very important for understanding all this. So if somebody says, I want to figure those stories out, I've got leads for you, places you can start. But that's a part of the story I haven't even begun to dig into. Now, I've put on the map, I've got 4 different tracks, the movement of freedom seekers. And what I want to reinforce is that they are journey stories, and they are all journeys that come right through our region because of some of the reasons we've talked about. Now, the first person, really briefly, is this remarkable young woman named Carolyn Quarles. At the age 16, she had been grew up in her master's house. At the age 16, decided to go for her freedom. And I've written a book about this. Just a remarkable saga where she manages to get onto a riverboat and makes it up to Galena. From Galena, she goes by stagecoach across to Milwaukee. And from Milwaukee, she comes down in a wide loop around Chicago and makes it to Detroit, where she ends up successfully making it. And she gets married and has children, and just an incredible story. But as she comes across her story, we know she stopped very near Westville, and she was in a pouring rainstorm with her. She was being escorted by an abolitionist from Milwaukee, and they stayed over in Crete for a little bit, for a couple of days, and they make it come up to Dyer, and they're on the Sauk Trail. They get to close to Westville, and it's a pouring down rain, and Lyman Goodnow, the conductor, knows that you can always trust the Quakers, but not Quakers, trust the Germans. And so he knocks on a door, and it's a German family, and he pleads for hospitality, and they let them in, and Carolyn ends up, they get their clothes dried off and all that kind of stuff. Carolyn ends up spending the night in bed with the farmer's wife. And Lyman Gordon writes years later, he said, I don't think that she really understood that she was in bed with a person of color. Wonderful kind of encounter there outside of Westville. We've written her story in several different places, including her stories in this book out of Michigan. The second is the story of Henry Stevenson, the fellow that's in this iconic picture. Henry was on a farm in central Missouri, and Martha and John, 2 slaves, ran away from the neighboring farm. And so that master came and talked to Henry's master and said, we got to get our slaves back, and why don't we bring Henry along to help us? And Henry readily agreed that he'd go help look for Martha and John. And so they take off, they go to St. Louis, they take a riverboat up the Illinois River, they go on the I&M Canal all the way to Chicago. And every time they stop,
Henry goes out and he visits all the blacks in that particular town, looking for Martha and John. And he comes back and says, well, didn't find them, but I know they're on their way. And so they get all up, and as they're going up on the I&M Canal, every time the boat stops, they get off and look, and Henry goes and looks among the black families, and his master and this other guy go and look around the white families, and they get back on the boat, and along the boat there are these Irish workmen on the I&M Canal, and they keep saying to Henry, why don't you escape? You're in the north, you're in Illinois, you can be free. And he says, no, I got to help my master. I'm helping my master. And so they go to the next town, and the same thing. Henry gets off the boat, the white guys get off the boat, they go looking around, they get back. Well, we've heard of John and Martha, but they're heading for Chicago. They get back on, and the Irishmen say, you're free. And Henry says, no, I gotta trust my masters. I'm working for my masters. They get to Chicago, okay? And what do? They get off the boat. Henry says, I'll go talk to the black people, and the two white guys are going to look at the white guys. Henry gets on a wagon that's driven by a black guy, and the black guy says to Henry, you're in the north, you want to be free? And Henry says, of course I want to be free. And so they take him to the abolitionists in Chicago, and the abolitionist says, we can get you on a ship right away, but we don't have any money for you, happened to be. And Henry says, I can get money. He goes back to his masters at the I&M Canal, at the boat dock, and he says, I think I have found John and Martha, but I need a little bit of cash. So they give him some money. He says, thank you very much. He goes back to the abolitionists. They put him on the Sam Ward. The Sam Ward was one of these little lake steamers that went from Chicago to the Punch Bowl, to Michigan City, to New Buffalo. And so Henry gets on this little lake steamer, comes right along our coast here. He gets off the boat at Michigan City, gets on the train, and goes to freedom. Just amazing. What a clever guy. And my final story. There's Henry, and well, here you can see there's Carolyn's journey, and there's Henry's journey going across. Okay, then it turns out that this picture also includes William Bush Johnson, who is a dear, dear friend of Henry's. They've been living together in Windsor, Canada, since the 1850s. And as a matter of fact, Bush, he lives until 1912. Well, Bush Johnson lived on a farm in western Kentucky, and he ran away, got himself up to the Ohio River, got across the Ohio River, and came just walked up from the Descends up into Park County, spent 3 months in Park County working for a farmer, and then he went from Park County to Logansport, and from Logansport he just walked straight up to Michigan City. And again was assisted by folks in Michigan City and got on the train and headed for freedom. And part of what's compelling is to realize we have got more stories like this. We just have to uncover. Okay, so and there's old Henry, and again, so we've got Carolyn's journey, and we've got Henry's journey, and then we've got Bush's journey coming right up the state of Indiana, and all of these folks having their stories here in Northwest Indiana. So one of the things that's fascinating to me in uncovering Bush's story was the fact that part of the way they talked about running away in western Kentucky was they said, you never want to go to Detroit, because if you go to Detroit, you're not in Canada, and Canada is on the other side of a river that's 3,000 miles wide. And of course, the Detroit River is about, a quarter mile. I mean, it's just, you could row across in 15 minutes. Okay, so there are stories. From 1830s and 1861, the start of the Civil War, 2,000 to 3,000 freedom seekers came right through your backyards here in Northwest Indiana, on the Sauk Trail corridor and on the Chicago Road corridor, and also using the railroads. And probably 1,000 to 1,500 walked or came by buggy, and 1,000 to 1,500 came on the trains. And it's a remarkable round of stories. I would love to have some help working on this. I know that there are places and resources in LaPorte and Porter County that I need to get to and look at, but my time is really limited. So if somebody gets real inspired, I'm willing to give you a homework assignment, and you can help me on this research. I would love to have us put together something so that people here in the region will know the strengths of these stories. Among other things, not only do the stories need to be told, but there may very well be a couple places here in Northwest Indiana that ought to be on the National Park Service listing of National Underground Railroad sites. I've had the good fortune of working with local historians to get 2 listed, one in Crete and one in Lockport. We're working on getting the Ton Farm listed on the National Register. And right now there are about 22 sites in Illinois, about 25 in Indiana. In Indiana, they are all in the South. Ain't a single one up here. So again, if somebody wants to get intrigued by that project, let me know. Well, I've talked a long time, but I'd love to have some questions, and we'll carry on. Questions? Or did I totally overwhelm you?
Answered it.
Yes.
With the Society of Friends, you know, they still have these meeting houses out there. Did they continue to differentiate the anti-slavery from the regular Society of Friends, or
They got back together. They got back together in 1856.
Okay.
So, like 1843 to 1856, there was the Indiana Annual Meeting of Friends and the Indiana Annual Meeting of Anti-Slavery Friends. And I think, and that's why we're just a lot more work needs to be done, I think that Charles Osborne was very involved in this movement. And I think the reason he may have come to Westville and to the Clear Lake Meeting of Friends was because they were so adamant about being part of this anti-slavery conversation. But they finally, and you see, it was very awkward because for the Friends, they were nominally against slavery, but they didn't like these rabble-rousers. You know, they would have, you know, we can't be having, and this is almost a direct quote, we cannot be having anti-slavery meetings in our Friends' meeting houses. That's just over the edge. Of course we think slavery is bad, but we can't be doing all this activist stuff. And I think we know throughout the history of American churches, there's always been that controversy between people that see their church or their Friends meeting as a place of reflection and sanctuary rather than a place of activism. That's always been a kind of tension. And the Friends that got so serious in the 1840s that they split. Yeah.
This is kind of a footnote question. You mentioned the Great Stock Trail going from the Crown Point to Valparaiso to like LaPorte. And I was wondering if there was ever a branch of that went through Michigan City, or that was always a separate. Because when I was a reporter in Michigan City, one of the local historians was talking about the what you called the Chicago Road. I think that's what he was talking about. And he said that it was also the Sauk Trail at a time or something.
Well, okay. Remember that the Sauk Trail and the Chicago Road become the same thing once you get into Michigan. Okay? That's part of it. The second thing is that I use the language of corridors because I want to get away from the fact that did everybody walk literally along the Sauk Trail? No. You know, there were other routes, but also there were places, like I've got one report that says that there was the passage of folks, and here's Westville here, that the passage of folks, particularly from southern Illinois, some came up and they didn't go on the Sauk Trail. They went straight on up to Michigan City. And so the folks in Michigan City, the Lowe's were down here. The folks around Westville, there were some farms up in here, some to the west, and some of the other farms were down here. And so it gets a little bit muddy exactly where people went. Is it possible that folks came up the Sauk Trail and then went to Michigan City? Absolutely. That seems reasonable that they would do that. And it could be that they get here and they get to Westville and they say, "My God, we understand there are a bunch of slave catchers in LaPorte. Why don't you guys go up to Michigan City instead of LaPorte?" And so instead of going this way, they would go that way. There also was a very highly developed traffic between LaPorte and Michigan City, and it's quite reasonable to assume that freedom seekers that got to LaPorte may have, in looking for transportation, may have been carried to Michigan City rather than the other way. So yeah, that's why I say don't focus on the corridors rather than the routes.
Okay.
Larry?
Yeah.
And that's really curious to me. These are people who didn't have maps, right? Is that correct?
Yeah.
I mean, how do they know to ask anybody to go where to go? I mean, huh? Like,
Well, for
where
one
do
thing,
I go to
yeah,
be free? I mean, how do I get there? I don't know this. They don't know anything really about the area.
Okay, but remember that also it's very. Remember my picture of the Sauk Trail?
Uh-huh.
You know, if you're walking, you're not going to miss the Sauk Trail.
Okay.
And that people traveling up into Illinois, if people said, "How do you get to Detroit from Illinois?"
Okay.
There's only one way.
Okay.
Okay. There's only one way to get to Detroit, and that's to take the Sauk Trail. And like today, we have the luxury of all kinds of different roads, but they didn't have it. There were varieties of wagon roads, but the major roads were pretty obvious. And also, we've got, and again, we don't know for sure, but we've got very suggestive evidence that there were some maps that were developed for people to use. But the major thing was that once freedom seekers got into northern Illinois and northern Indiana, they were fairly safe. They could travel during the day, and they had to be discreet, but they could travel during the day. And there were lots of people who might not be willing to help them, but would give them advice. Oh yeah, the Williams family, they're up this, just follow the trail, across that creek and around the big tree, and that's where the Williams house is, and they'll help you. And so that kind of information sharing was pretty obvious, but also the routes were not that, if you're on the Chicago Road, you're on it. If you're on the Sauk Trail, you're on it, unlike our profusion of roads. Yeah.
It seems like Route 12 is the main northern.
Yeah, Route 12 is basically Chicago Road, an awful lot of it. Yeah, and I think, let's see it here. This is here's Route 12 right under my line. And it goes, actually, yeah, this is exactly, Route 12 is exactly. Pardon?
It heads east from New Buffalo.
That's right.
Three Oaks, Niles.
That's right. Yeah. So Route 12 is, and you can't be rigid about it, but is Route 12 basically Chicago Road? Yeah, basically. And then of course in our area, coming down from Dalton and all, is the Michigan City Road. Well, gosh, that's pretty. And it bends the right way and then heads over through Gary.
And that move towards Indiana Avenue and the straight down, I assume, was to be able to travel all year round rather than just in the nice weather.
Exactly. And once the ferry was installed in '37, and then they built a bridge there in 1843, it really cemented. It became an all-weather road. The Chicago Road became an all-weather road because you could drop straight out of Chicago, and it's no accident that you've got Michigan Avenue and Indiana Avenue coming down out of Chicago, because those are the major avenues coming straight down to the ferry at the Indiana Street Bridge.
Thank you. I apologize.
Well,
I have to run.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think we're done. And if somebody wants to help with some research, I'd be delighted to have some help. Hopefully, within a couple months, I will have a fairly substantial research paper done, and then we'll figure out some ways to get it into people's hands so that this stuff is available. The Indiana State Department of Natural Resources has done very good research on the Underground Railroad in Indiana, and they do have one essay on Northwest Indiana that was very helpful to me, but it's not a complete story, but it was really helpful.
Larry, you mentioned having people perhaps help you. Do you have contact information you can share so that people could use that to get in touch with you?
Sure. If you want to, after we break up, I'll be glad to give you my email. Thank you. That's a great idea. And I'll give you my email, and we can be in touch. I guess I'm done.
All right. We asked for announcements at the beginning, and so I'll ask for announcements at the end.
Oh, one announcement.
Okay.
Excuse me. This is the Journal of the South Suburban Genealogical and Historical Society. It's a special issue, and the issue is basically my essay on research on the Dalton Ferry and the Ton Farm. And I have a handful of copies of these. Tom, did you bring any?
No, we have.
That's okay. Yeah, right. Anyways, $5. $5 American. That's what they cost. We had to buy them for $5. If you give me $5, you can have one of these guys. All right.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
But you're not the only one. Linda?
I wanted to, my name's Linda Swisher. I'm with the Hammond Public Library.
Linda! My God.
And I'm also on the board of South Suburban Genealogical and Historical Society. So I wanted to invite you on behalf of the library. We are having a Black History program 2 weeks from tonight on Tuesday the 19th at 6 o'clock at the library. Genealogist Tony Burrows will be doing back-to-back lectures. So it should be a very packed evening with information. He's going to be talking about from census to slavery, and also did your ancestors serve in the Civil War?
And what time was that again?
6 o'clock.
Okay.
At the Hammond Library 2 weeks from tonight.
All right.
So what's your right hand time? What's your right?
Any other announcements? All right. Thank you for coming, and we'll see you a month from tonight, March 5th, and it will be the Cedar Lake Historical Association will be presenting, and I'm not sure exactly the individuals, but I think probably one of them will be Julie Zavada.
Great.
I think her last name is that.